They called it a celebration and lit a small forest of candles in the middle of the table, the room warm with the hum of clinking glassware and the soft piano from the bar. And I remember thinking that 27 is not old, and yet it felt like a finish line I had crossed alone, because the faces around me wore the kind of smiles people practice in mirrors when they want a picture to look better than the truth. And then my husband raised his phone in that casual way he always did when he wanted to capture something he could replay later for laughs. And my mother-in-law slid a thick envelope across the linen like she was gifting me perfume. And I knew from the weight and from the way her eyes glittered that this would be a moment she hoped I would never forget. If you feel that little knot in your chest the way I did, please tap like or leave a quick note for me right now. Even a few kind words matter more than you know, and they help me bring you more stories like this, and thank you for being here with me. I'm Emily, I'm 27 years old, and this is how my birthday gift became the neat little door I walked through to end a very long night. The envelope was smooth and cold against my palm, and the heavy silence that followed her announcement felt like a dare, as if everyone was holding their breath to measure how loudly I would break. And in that hush, I caught the scent of lemon from the water glass, the buttery sweetness of the bread basket, the simple proof that life carries on with or without your permission. And I felt something inside me settle the way a lake goes quiet after a storm, because I had already decided who I was going to be when the paper touched my fingertips. I pulled out the documents, crisp and clean, with my name set in bold type as if I were a company closing for the season, and I could almost hear my husband's smirk behind the phone, even though he said nothing, because he didn't have to. The phone said it all. The lens was the crowd he wanted, the applause he craved, the proof that I would finally supply the kind of entertainment his mother loved to curate. I took the pen that came clipped to the folder, and I signed where they told me to sign, and I did it slowly, not to prolong the moment, but to savor the calm I had been building for months. A calm made of long nights with my laptop open, of quiet appointments, of copies and passwords and keys, and when I set the pen down, I thanked her with a smile that felt like a ribbon cutting, and I stood, straightened the hem of my dress, and walked out into the night where the air was cool and surprisingly gentle on my skin, like the world itself was exhaling with me. I know it sounds unreal to leave your own birthday dinner without raising your voice or throwing a glass of water or asking why, but there was nothing left to ask, no mystery to solve, because the mystery had already been solved in the months before this night, in a version of me they had never bothered to imagine. I remember the valet's surprised blink as he handed me my ticket, the soft squeal of the brakes as a car pulled up, the red tail lights pulsing like a steady heartbeat, and I remember thinking that freedom is not a loud thing. It is a door that opens with a simple click. It is a decision that becomes a habit. It is the ability to leave a table without explaining what you have already understood. Inside the restaurant, someone laughed too brightly, and a fork hit a plate, and behind me the glass panels held their reflections like a framed picture. A little family gathered around a cake they ordered for show, and I suddenly felt a lightness in my shoulders, a sense that I was carrying only myself now, and that was so much less than I had been carrying before. I slid into the back seat, folded the envelope shut even though it didn't matter anymore, and asked the driver to take me home, not the house I shared with them, but the place that had become mine long before they thought to cut me loose. On the ride, city lights ran like stitches along the streets, and each passing block felt like another seam coming apart, not in a scary way, but in the way a too-tight dress finally relaxes after you breathe out, and the quiet let me hear the rhythm of my own thoughts again. I went back to the beginning, not of the marriage, but of the version of me that started this plan, the woman who learned to tuck her hurt into neat corners and watch the room like a chessboard, the woman who stopped asking why they were unkind and started asking what would keep me safe, the woman who learned the sweetness of silence because silence gives you time. What if, I had asked myself months ago, I do not fight where they can see me? What if I do not try to win a game they invented? What if I write a new rule book and never hand it to them? What if I stop begging for respect and quietly build a life that does not require their permission? The answer became my habit, and then my habit became a map, and that map is why I was able to sign in peace while they recorded a performance I refused to give. When I reached my building, the lobby smelled faintly of eucalyptus and clean tile, and the security guard nodded the way people nod when they recognize your face, but not your story. And I liked it that way, because invisibility is a fine cloak when you are arranging your future. And I rode the elevator up with the envelope tucked under my arm like a newspaper that had already been read and recycled. In the quiet of my apartment, I did what has anchored me on the hardest days. I filled the kettle. I waited for the soft rattle that meant it was near a boil. I poured a cup of tea and wrapped my hands around it, and I let the heat bring my thoughts into focus. And in that steam, I saw the small, relentless choices that had carried me here, the careful saving, the copying of statements, the meetings at lunch hours, the passwords written in a notebook only I knew existed, the document I had filed last week that would surprise them more than any outburst ever could. I wish I could tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, but what I felt was steadiness, like finding your balance after a long tunnel, and I let myself sit with that steadiness, because I had learned the difference between drama and power. And I chose power, the quiet kind that does not need witnesses. My phone vibrated on the counter with a string of messages that began as jokes and softened into questions and finally hardened into blame, and I let them collect without opening them because I had decided long ago that my emotions would not live on their schedule, and because I knew the real response was already waiting for them in places they did not think to look. If you are still with me, thank you, and I hope as you listen you feel less alone in any room where you have been made small, because I am telling this to remind us both that grace can be a shield and a sword at the same time. I stood and walked to the window, the city spread out like a lake of lights, and I pressed my palm to the cool glass and promised myself that this birthday would not be remembered as the day they broke me, but as the day I kept a promise I had made to myself in the quiet months, a promise to never again hand my story to people who treated it like a prop. The night deepened, and the street below thinned to occasional taxis and dog walkers, and I felt that familiar ripple of fear, the one that asks, what if you are wrong? What if you are not strong enough? What if tomorrow they pull the rug and you are left standing on nothing? And I met that fear with the truth I had been building. What if, instead, tomorrow is the first day you wake up and breathe all the way to the bottom of your lungs? What if tomorrow your name on paper is not a verdict, but a gateway? What if they only think they are filming the end when you have already started the beginning? I placed the signed envelope in a drawer with other papers that mattered, and set an alarm for the early meeting I had scheduled for the morning, the kind of meeting that does not need applause because it has signatures of its own, and I smiled a small private smile for the woman who had learned to play the long game while everyone else asked for proof she was losing. The restaurant video would make its rounds in their family chat. The little clips would be replayed with commentary and smug predictions. But the version of that night that mattered most lived here, in my chest, where the air finally tasted like it belonged to me. And as the kettle cooled and the apartment settled into that late-night hush where even the refrigerator hum feels friendly, I knew the birthday was not a cliff after all. It was a bridge, and I had already crossed more of it than they would ever guess. Tomorrow, I would begin to reveal the things they never imagined I could do, not with a speech or a scene, but with the gentle pressure of consequences arriving exactly on time, and that thought was the softest blanket I have ever pulled over my shoulders. They believed they handed me an ending on pretty paper. They had no idea I had signed my way into the next act long before the candles were lit. When I first entered this family, I believed in love the way a child believes in fairy tales, convinced that marriage was a shelter, a safe flame that could warm me through any storm, and at 27 I stood smiling on my wedding day, blind to the shadows already gathering around me. In those early months, I clung to the illusion of belonging, convinced my mother-in-law's polished warmth was genuine, her compliments sincere, her approval a gift I had somehow earned. Holidays were staged like magazine covers with endless tables and glittering glasses, and I told myself this was happiness, even as the subtle corrections of my stories, the small dismissals of my opinions, and the growing dependency of my husband on her nod of approval hinted at a truth I wasn't ready to face. I let myself drown in appearances, desperate to believe I had found not just a husband, but a family. Over time, the cracks widened, though they came quietly, not as shouts or blows, but as steady ridicules wrapped in laughter, as jokes filmed on my husband's phone, as whispers passed among relatives who found humor in my frustration. My mother-in-law referred to our home as hers, to our furniture as her choices, to our lives as her success story, and each time my husband echoed her words, I felt a little less like a wife and a little more like a prop on their stage. I learned quickly that resistance was dangerous, not because it would provoke rage, but because it would invite mockery, and I soon discovered that nothing was more isolating than being laughed at by the very people who claimed to love you. Still, I wanted to believe, and so I wrapped my wounds in excuses, telling myself mothers were protective, that families were complicated, that my husband's silence was discomfort rather than betrayal. I convinced myself that patience would fix what was breaking, that love would bloom again if I only endured. But late at night, when the house was quiet, the bandages slipped and the truth bled through. The night I overheard them in the kitchen, her voice sharp as she said I was young enough to bend, and his laugh satisfied as he agreed, was the night the illusion shattered, not in rage but in clarity. For in that sound I finally understood I was not a partner to them. I was entertainment, a toy they reshaped for their amusement and discarded when I no longer fit their design. But what they never understood was that when an illusion breaks, it does not leave you weak. It leaves you free, and that freedom planted a seed inside me that grew quietly, with every forced smile and every staged dinner. On the surface, I continued to play the role they had written for me, but within, I began to collect myself in silence, the kind of silence that studies and learns, the kind that waits for the right moment. I became two people, the polite daughter-in-law they believed they had tamed and the quiet woman planning her escape. And while they were busy laughing at my supposed weakness, I was already preparing to prove that illusions are only as powerful as the people who believe in them. The longer I lived inside that house, the more I realized that marriage is not destroyed by one loud betrayal, but by 1,000 quiet cuts, and mine came in the form of little humiliations that blurred together until I could hardly tell where my dignity had gone. My husband learned to echo his mother's tone until her voice lived in his mouth, dismissing my concerns as overreactions, brushing off my tears as drama, and laughing whenever I tried to explain how small I felt. I noticed how our private arguments became public jokes, little clips sent to his siblings or replayed at gatherings, where my frustration was entertainment for those who claimed to be my family. It was not rage that broke me in those moments, but the steady erosion of being unseen, and the more invisible I became, the more carefully I began to watch. There were evenings when he returned home late, smelling of cologne that was not mine, speaking with a careless lightness that felt like betrayal even if I could not yet prove it. And though I wanted to scream, I swallowed the words, teaching myself the art of silence. I discovered that silence can be more powerful than anger, because anger gave them more fuel to mock me, while silence gave me the chance to observe, to memorize, to piece together patterns they never thought I would notice. It was in that silence I began to collect evidence without naming it, evidence, to tuck away scraps of information, to learn which accounts he favored, which secrets she whispered, which smiles were genuine, and which were rehearsed. The cracks in our marriage grew deeper when I understood that love was no longer present between us, only performance, and that he had chosen his role as his mother's son long before he had chosen the role of my husband. I realized that every decision we made was filtered through her approval, every plan bent until it suited her vision, every dream I had trimmed down until it fit into the narrow box she allowed me. What once felt like partnership now resembled a cage, gilded with expensive dinners and polished appearances, but suffocating in every hidden corner. And though I smiled for the cameras they raised, My heart grew heavier with each passing day. Yet within that heaviness, something sharper began to form, the outline of a plan, the first trace of an answer to the question that had been circling me for months. What if I no longer played by their rules? I began to look at my marriage less as a union and more as a stage where every curtain call was dictated by someone else, and the more I studied it, the more I saw how fragile their power truly was. They thought they controlled me because they controlled the narrative, because my laughter or tears belonged to their recordings, but they did not see that my silence was already a strategy, that my stillness was already a weapon, that while they were busy performing, I was quietly rewriting the script. The cracks in my marriage, once terrifying to face, became windows that let me see what had always been true, that nothing about this life was mine except my ability to walk away, and that one day I would do exactly that, not broken and not begging, but steady, ready, and far stronger than they ever imagined. It happened on a night that wore the mask of normalcy, the kind of family gathering that outsiders would mistake for warmth, with candles flickering in crystal holders, platters of roasted lamb and golden potatoes passed around with exaggerated cheer, and the air thick with the sweetness of wine and the sharp bite of laughter echoing too loudly off the polished walls. I moved quietly among them, carrying plates, pouring drinks, and arranging napkins as if my worth was measured in how invisible I could make myself, and for a while I let myself pretend that this was what belonging looked like. But then my mother-in-law leaned back in her chair, her pearls catching the light, her voice smooth and cold as she asked if I had finally learned how to keep a house, or if her son was still living like a bachelor under my so-called care. And the way she tilted her head told me this was no question. It was a blade. The laughter that followed stabbed through me like shards of glass, too sharp to be ignored, too practiced to be anything but deliberate. And when I turned toward my husband for the smallest scrap of protection, I found only the glow of his phone, the tiny red light of the camera that said he wanted my pain preserved forever. I excused myself from the table with a smile that cracked at the edges, stepping into the hallway where the air was cooler, quieter, and more honest. And there against the wall, I pressed my palm to the painted plaster to steady the trembling that shook through me, not from weakness but from the force of clarity that rushed in. The sounds of their laughter reached me faintly, muffled by the door, like waves from a storm I no longer needed to drown in, and for the first time I saw them for exactly what they were. Not a family, not a circle of love, but an audience feeding off my humiliation. They would never accept me, never respect me, never stop until I was so bent I no longer recognized myself, because for them, my undoing was entertainment. And in that realization, I felt something twist and shift inside me. A quiet breaking that was not of my heart, but of the last thread tying me to the illusion that I could earn their love if only I tried harder. As I stood there in the dim light of the hallway, I asked myself the questions I had been too afraid to whisper before, questions that felt like sparks landing on dry kindling. What if I stopped playing the role they wrote for me? What if I no longer gave them the tears they wanted? What if I used their arrogance against them and crafted my own ending to this play? My chest ached with the weight of it, but beneath the ache there was a pulse of something fierce, almost intoxicating, because for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a life not shaped by their laughter. The wallpaper beside me felt rough under my fingertips, grounding me, and I remember staring at the family photos hung in neat rows along the hall, smiling faces, posed perfection, a gallery of lies, and thinking that I would no longer be just another picture in their carefully arranged frame. I was going to step out of it, no matter how much it cost me. That seed of defiance rooted itself deep, and I could feel it spreading through me, filling spaces I hadn't realized were empty. When I finally returned to the dining room, I wore the mask they expected, my smile polite and practiced, my laughter soft and controlled, my movements careful, but inside I had changed in a way they could never measure. I lifted my glass when they toasted. I leaned in when stories were told, and I even joined in a burst of laughter that left me hollow. But behind my eyes, the decision had already been made. They thought that night marked my defeat, that their cruelty had left me smaller, more compliant, easier to break. But what they did not see was that their cruelty had given me the one thing I needed most: the certainty that I was done trying to win a game designed for me to lose. From that moment forward, every smile became camouflage, every silence became strategy, every nod became another stone in the foundation of the escape I was planning. They laughed louder than ever that night, convinced they had silenced me, but the truth was that their laughter had only awakened me, and though they thought they had broken me, I knew in the deepest part of myself that the real breaking point was not the end of my strength, but the beginning of my freedom. The night of that cruel gathering left me with a seed of certainty that grew quietly inside me, and from that point on, my life became a balance between the role I continued to play for them and the secret I began to build for myself. By day, I was the dutiful daughter-in-law who smiled when spoken to and nodded at every suggestion, but when the house grew quiet and their laughter faded into memory, I transformed into someone else entirely. My laptop became my weapon, its glow lighting the darkness as I researched laws, property rights, and quiet ways to protect myself without raising suspicion. I opened a bank account in my own name, depositing small amounts that would never catch their attention, and each time I moved money, I felt my heart race with fear and triumph at once. I copied statements and tucked them away in folders they would never find, like little lifeboats waiting for the day I would need to set sail. There were afternoons when I excused myself from errands, claiming I needed to run to the market or the post office, when in truth I was slipping into the office of a lawyer I had found through a friend of a friend. The first time I sat in that office, the leather chair cool beneath me, I felt the trembling of someone who has spent years being silenced, suddenly speaking again, and when I slid papers across the desk with shaking hands, I caught my reflection in the polished wood, eyes wide, lips pressed together, but alive in a way I hadn't been in years. The lawyer spoke calmly, guiding me through steps I never thought I would have the courage to take, and when I walked out into the sunlight afterward, carrying a folder that felt heavier than stone, I realized I had taken my first true step toward freedom. In the middle of these secret errands, I found unexpected allies. A coworker who noticed the shadows under my eyes and quietly covered my shifts so I could attend meetings. A neighbor who kept my spare copies safe without asking questions. And even a bank clerk who offered me advice with a gentle look that told me she understood more than I admitted. These people were small lights in the darkness, flickers of kindness that reminded me I was not as alone as I had believed. At night, I replayed their words, their small gestures of support, and they stitched me back together in ways my own family had failed to do. I began to realize that strength doesn't always roar loudly. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hides in corners until you are ready to notice it, and when I finally began to see it, I found it had been inside me all along. The strangest part was how calm I became in their presence once I knew I had my secret preparations. At dinners, when my mother-in-law mocked me, I smiled, but behind that smile was the knowledge that I had already begun pulling away the threads of the web she thought held me captive. When my husband raised his phone to record, I looked into the lens not with fear, but with the quiet defiance of someone who knew that the real story was unfolding far beyond his screen. Every insult became easier to endure, every humiliation lighter to carry, because I knew what they did not, that while they were busy laughing, I was already building an exit they would never see coming. Their power over me was slipping away piece by piece, and the best part was that they had no idea, because my silence was not submission anymore, it was strategy, and every day brought me closer to the moment when all of my careful preparations would come together, like a key turning in a long locked door. From the outside, nothing seemed to change, and that was exactly how I wanted it, because in their eyes, I was still the obedient wife and accommodating daughter-in-law, smiling when spoken to, arranging flowers on the table, and carrying trays like my value was measured in silence. But inside, my world was shifting with every careful step I took, and I began to live like two people stitched together, one wearing the mask they had chosen for me, the other quietly weaving a life of her own in the shadows. By day, I endured their performances, their laughter, their smug remarks, while by night, I became the architect of a secret plan, studying laws until my eyes burned, memorizing details of accounts, and scribbling notes that I hid beneath loose floorboards. Each morning, I rehearsed their version of me so convincingly that even I sometimes forgot I was acting. But when the lights went out, I remembered who I was becoming. It was a dangerous balance, this double life, because the smallest slip could have exposed everything, and I learned to control every flicker of expression, every tremor of voice. When my husband scrolled through my phone, expecting to find nothing but recipes and polite texts, he never knew the passwords written in invisible ink in a notebook disguised as a grocery list, nor the emails sent from an account he would never discover. When my mother-in-law commented on how agreeable I had become, how well I was fitting in, I bit back the bitter laugh that rose in my throat, because her praise only confirmed how well my disguise was working. Every time she congratulated herself for bending me, I knew it was really me bending her, turning her arrogance into the cover I needed. But the double life was not just strategy, it was survival, and survival demanded more than documents and bank accounts. It demanded strength of spirit, the kind you build quietly in the small hours when the world is asleep. There were nights I sat alone at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator keeping me company, my hands shaking as I read through contracts or highlighted sections of law books borrowed from the library, and in those moments, fear pressed on my chest so heavily I thought it might break me. Yet each time the fear rose, I forced myself to breathe through it, to imagine the future I was building, a future where I was no longer the punchline of their cruel jokes. Sometimes I whispered it to myself like a prayer. One day this will end. One day I will walk away whole, and in that whisper, I found enough courage to keep going. What they never understood was that their constant belittling only sharpened me, because every insult gave me more reason to prepare, every slight more fuel to finish what I had started. At a family dinner, when my husband raised his glass and mocked my cooking, I smiled as though I agreed, but inside I was cataloging which accounts his paycheck flowed into and how to divert them. When my mother-in-law boasted that she had everything under control, I leaned into her confidence like a shield, because her certainty blinded her to the quiet rebellion growing under her nose. They believed they owned the script of my life, but they did not realize that I had already begun writing a new one, line by line, in invisible ink, and the day would come when the mask I wore for them would fall away, and they would see not the woman they thought they had broken, but the woman who had quietly outplayed them all along. There is always a moment when all the small humiliations that you have carried like pebbles in your pockets suddenly become a mountain crushing down on your chest, and for me it arrived on an evening that looked no different from the others, with the table laid out in perfect symmetry, candles flickering against polished glass, and the air heavy with the mingled scents of roasted garlic, rosemary, and expensive perfume. I moved around that room like a ghost in my own life, setting out forks, passing bread, filling glasses, trying to convince myself that endurance was the same as peace. But I knew deep inside that every polite smile chipped away at what little strength I had left. And then my mother-in-law leaned forward in her chair, her pearls catching the light, her eyes sharp with triumph, and in a voice dripping with sweetness, she announced to the room that she had never understood what her son had seen in me, because surely he could have done better. The laughter that followed was not simple amusement, it was cruel and deliberate, the sound of people enjoying the tearing apart of someone too polite to scream. My husband lifted his glass, grinning like it was a toast in his honor, and in that instant, the illusion I had been clinging to snapped clean in half. I excused myself before my face betrayed me, stepping out into the hallway where the walls seemed to lean close, covered in family portraits, arranged like trophies, each frame holding smiles so staged they almost looked like masks. The dim light of the chandelier caught my reflection in the glass, and I saw myself standing there, eyes hollow with exhaustion, shoulders slumped from years of carrying pain in silence. But beneath all of that, there was something new, something sharp, something alive. I studied that reflection the way a stranger studies a painting, searching for meaning, and I realized that what I was seeing was not weakness, but a spark of defiance that had refused to die no matter how hard they had tried to stamp it out. My pulse hammered so loudly in my ears that it felt like a drum, but the beat steadied me, reminding me that I was still here, still standing, still capable of more than simply enduring. In that quiet hallway, surrounded by photographs of their staged perfection, I made the unspoken vow that I would never again measure my worth by their laughter. When I walked back into the dining room, my face was calm, my movements unhurried, and the transformation was so seamless that they didn't notice a thing. They went on with their chatter and jokes, never realizing that I was memorizing every word, storing away each insult like ammunition for a battle they didn't even know was coming. My husband reached for his phone, smirking as he angled the camera toward me, certain he was capturing another clip of me looking foolish. But this time, I met the lens with steady eyes and the faintest hint of a smile that was not amusement, but quiet defiance. I knew he would watch the recording later, laugh at what he thought he had captured, never realizing he had filmed the precise moment his power over me slipped away forever. The longer I sat there, the more certain I became that I was no longer a pawn in their game, but a player quietly setting the board for myself, and though they believed they had cornered me, I knew I was the one who had already begun to win. That night, lying in bed beside my husband while his breathing came heavy and untroubled, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I had not felt in years: peace. Not because the cruelty had stopped, not because my life had suddenly changed, but because I finally understood that their power existed only in the space I gave them, and that space had shrunk to nothing. The last straw had been placed upon me, and instead of breaking me, it had hardened me, forged me into someone they would not recognize when the time came. I traced the outline of my plan in my mind like a map, each step leading me closer to freedom, each secret preparation fitting into place. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to imagine what life might feel like when I was no longer trapped in their world. I closed my eyes as the moonlight spilled across the floor, not with dread but with calm certainty, and I slept soundly, knowing that the next time they laughed at me, they would be laughing at the mask, never realizing that the woman behind it had already walked away. The evening was staged to look like a celebration, but from the moment I walked into the restaurant with its polished marble floors, soft golden lights, and the faint music of a piano drifting from the corner, I felt the weight of something darker waiting for me. The table had been set for a show, not for a birthday, with my mother-in-law presiding at the center like a queen in pearls, and my husband at her side, phone in hand, ready to capture whatever performance they had prepared. Candles flickered across polished glasses, waiters moved with silent precision, and strangers dining nearby might have mistaken the scene for a family honoring one of their own. But I knew better, because every smile around me was too sharp, every gesture too rehearsed, and my chest tightened with the certainty that I was walking into another trap. When the appetizers arrived, I forced myself to smile and murmur thanks, my palms damp against the linen napkin, and I counted the beats of my own heart, steadying myself for whatever came next. The moment revealed itself in the form of a white envelope, placed before me with exaggerated care by my mother-in-law, who leaned back in her chair with triumph glittering in her eyes as though she had just unveiled a masterpiece. "From all of us," she announced in that syrupy voice sharpened by malice, and for one suspended second the entire table seemed to hold its breath, savoring the anticipation of my reaction. My husband lifted his phone, the small lens glinting like the eye of a predator, eager to capture every flicker of humiliation, and I felt the stares of relatives prick against my skin like needles. With fingers that trembled only slightly, I lifted the envelope, already knowing what it contained, the weight of it telling me more than the paper inside ever could. The laughter began before I even opened it, soft chuckles rolling into cruel giggles, and when I slid the documents free and saw my name printed in bold letters above the word divorce, the room seemed to tilt for a moment before settling into sharp, merciless clarity. I held the papers in my hands, crisp and cold, their edges biting lightly into my skin, and for a fleeting second I wondered if they were waiting for me to cry, to scream, to plead. Perhaps they imagined I would storm out in anger or collapse in tears, giving them the spectacle they craved, the recording that would be replayed with smug satisfaction. But instead of panic, I felt something entirely different, a deep, quiet calm that I had cultivated in secret, the calm of someone who has already prepared for this very moment. I took the pen clipped to the folder and signed my name with steady strokes, each letter a declaration that I was no longer theirs to mock. My smile, polite and almost serene, cut through their expectations like glass, and when I set the pen down and slid the papers back across the table, the silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had been. I thanked her, my voice smooth and controlled, and I rose from my chair with the dignity of someone who refused to be their victim, smoothing the hem of my dress as though leaving a birthday dinner early was the most natural thing in the world. The walk out of that restaurant felt like the longest and shortest walk of my life, every step echoing against the marble floor, while behind me the clinking of glasses and forced chatter tried to mask the awkward stillness my reaction had left behind. I could feel the eyes of strangers following me, not in pity, but in curiosity, perhaps wondering why a young woman would leave her own celebration, with her head held high and a faint smile playing at her lips. Outside, the night air hit me like a blessing, cool and cleansing, carrying away the stale perfume of the dining room and replacing it with the honest scent of the city, asphalt, car exhaust, and faint traces of blooming flowers from planters near the curb. The valet looked startled as I handed him my ticket, his eyes flicking toward the envelope in my hand, but I simply nodded and slipped into the back seat of the car as though I had just completed an errand. In truth, I had completed something far greater. I had closed a chapter of my life not with tears or anger, but with a signature and a quiet exit. What none of them knew, what none of them could even begin to guess, was that the real story hadn't ended in that restaurant. It had only just begun, because I had already set in motion a plan that would make this cruel little performance the first act of their downfall. When the restaurant doors closed behind me, and the night wrapped itself around my shoulders, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because the pain was gone, but because I no longer carried it for them to feed on. In my lap, the envelope rested like an old riddle already solved, and I let my fingers trace the sharp edge of the papers, knowing that those signatures meant little compared to what I had already set in motion. They thought they had staged my undoing, that they had handed me humiliation dressed as a birthday gift. But the truth was, I had been preparing for this moment long before they lit those candles, and their cruel little show was nothing more than the curtain call of their own arrogance. As the car pulled through the city streets, I watched the passing lights blur like streaks of gold and silver, and I let myself replay the quiet victories that had led me here, the hidden moves they had never noticed because they had been too busy laughing. Months earlier, I had begun transferring small sums into an account only I could touch, the deposits so careful, so ordinary, that no one ever thought to ask where the extra money went. I had gathered deeds, copied statements, and filed papers that shifted the ownership of the house into my name, a process so quiet and meticulous that even my husband, who prided himself on knowing everything, never suspected a thing. I had catalogued his reckless spending, documented his late-night disappearances, and tucked away proof of his mismanagement that painted him not as a responsible husband, but as a man carelessly gambling with his future. Each file, each signature, each document was a brick laid in the foundation of my escape, and by the time they handed me divorce papers, the structure of my independence was already standing strong behind me, unseen but unshakable. And it wasn't only finances I had secured. I had learned to use their own arrogance as a weapon, planting seeds with people they underestimated, confiding in a quiet lawyer who knew how to build cases that didn't collapse under pressure, befriending a clerk at the bank who guided me with subtle nods and coded advice, finding allies in places my in-laws never thought to look. While they mocked me for being meek, I was building connections that wrapped around me like invisible armor, and though they thought they had isolated me, I had never been more protected. The laughter that once wounded me had become fuel, pushing me to prepare more carefully, to move more cleverly, to ensure that when the time came, I would not simply walk away. I would leave them standing in the ruins of the empire they had built on my silence. So, as they sat in that restaurant replaying my reaction on a glowing screen, convinced they had captured proof of my weakness, I was already picturing the moment when the truth would crash down on them like a wave. They would discover the accounts no longer under their control, the house no longer in their possession, the evidence of fraud and misconduct waiting in sealed envelopes ready for the right hands, and the smug certainty they had worn like armor would crumble into fear. They believed the story ended with me walking out into the night, but what they could not grasp was that my quiet exit was not surrender, it was strategy. The unveiling would not come in shouts or confrontations, but in the steady unraveling of everything they had once used to bind me, and by the time they understood what had happened, it would be far too late. I had signed their papers, yes, but they had unknowingly signed away the very power they thought they held over me. The aftermath unfolded like a storm they never saw coming, first with faint rumbles they ignored, then with cracks of thunder so loud it rattled every wall of their perfect little kingdom. My husband returned home one evening with panic stamped across his face, his hands shaking as he waved notices from the bank that told him his accounts were frozen, his credit lines revoked, his debts uncovered. He stammered questions he could not answer, asking how it happened, searching for explanations that would never come from me, because I only watched him with the calmness of someone who had already known this moment was inevitable. My mother-in-law burst into the driveway days later, her pearl necklace twisted in her fury, shouting that something had gone terribly wrong with her investments, that her reputation was being whispered about in places where whispers turned into fire. She demanded I explain myself, demanded I fix what she believed was hers by right, but I simply opened the door and handed her the documents proving that the house, the cars, and even the vacation property were no longer in their grasp. The shock that rippled across her face was the first crack in her armor, and I knew then that the empire they built on cruelty was collapsing piece by piece. But the real reversal came sharper than even I imagined. The evidence I had carefully collected, receipts of his gambling debts, records of money he funneled from joint accounts, proof of loans taken under false pretenses, landed directly in the hands of people who would not be silenced. The phone calls began with polite warnings from lawyers, escalated into threats from creditors, and finally ended in knocks at the door from officials carrying papers that demanded his presence in court. I watched as the smirk that had once mocked me drained from his face, leaving only the pale, desperate look of a man realizing that his arrogance had written his own downfall. My mother-in-law, who had once orchestrated every gathering like a queen presiding over her court, now sat at kitchen tables with her hands trembling, trying to spin lies that no one believed, her voice breaking as she realized her influence held no weight outside the walls where she once ruled. The laughter that had once surrounded me like chains had gone silent, replaced by whispers of scandal and disgrace that followed them everywhere they went. For me, justice did not come as the loud spectacle they had hoped for when they plotted my humiliation, but as the slow, deliberate unraveling of everything they thought untouchable. I moved through my days in a quiet rhythm, signing papers that secured my independence, walking through the rooms of my home that were now legally mine, and savoring the stillness of mornings where I could sip coffee without fear of ridicule. Yet there were moments when the intensity of it all nearly overwhelmed me, when I would stand at the window late at night watching the city lights flicker and think of how close I had come to breaking, how easily their cruelty could have swallowed me whole if I had not found the strength to fight back in silence. And in those moments, I realized that the real victory was not in taking away their power, but in reclaiming my own, because freedom is not just the absence of chains, it is the presence of choice, and for the first time in years, every choice belonged to me. Still, the final twist came not in their collapse, but in my own revelation. I was invited to a community gathering weeks later, a simple dinner hosted by neighbors who had always been kind, and as I walked into that room filled with warmth and easy laughter, I felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. For years I had mistaken noise for family, cruelty for love, performance for belonging. But here, in this ordinary room, I found the quiet truth of connection. I realized that the night they handed me divorce papers, the night they thought they destroyed me, was the night they unknowingly gave me back my life. And when I finally spoke to those neighbors, when I thanked them for welcoming me without judgment, I understood that justice was never about revenge alone. It was about survival, about reclaiming dignity, about proving that even when others try to write your ending, you can take the pen back and write a new beginning. Sometimes the cruelest gift is the one that sets you free, and my birthday, the night that began as humiliation, became the night I turned the page, not broken, not bitter, but stronger than they could ever imagine. And if this story touched you even a little, if you found yourself holding your breath the way I once did, I'd love for you to take a second to write a comment and tell me what you felt, or what part of this story stayed with you most, because your words mean more than you realize, and they keep me going when nights get heavy. Don't forget to tap that like button too. It's such a small gesture, but it makes a world of difference. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Every bit of support from you is like a hand reaching out to remind me I'm not alone, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts.